Big Brother, 1984, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, doublethink. It's almost impossible for us to understand how we talk to one another about these totalitarian questions until Orwell had supplied us with the language in which to do it. And I believe that he himself would say that that was one of his, if not his greatest accomplishment. He also had, maybe one of the reasons why he could do it, he had the authentic voice of English radicalism. He said somewhere that one of the things he wanted to see was England humiliated by nobody and humiliating nobody.
Keep the Aspidistra Flying is a tiny book, but he had a gem of a perception in it, and the book is just perfect, you know, just from the first page to the last page, you really wouldn't want to change it. It's a dry, small, sour, sad little book, but what it says is absolutely fantastic. You can't get it out of your head. Because what he's saying, I think, in that book is that, finally, is that the greatest problem in social problems, the greatest problem in alleviating man's condition, is that the poor have been given such a bad time for so many years. They have so many really bad, filthy habits built into them by the fact that they're poor, by the fact they've been frustrated, by the fact they've been inhibited from any kind of good life, that when the time comes for them to open out, to begin to have a good time, to begin to express themselves, if they have a little good fortune, they have to blow it, they have to ruin it, they have to just spoil it. Spiritually, they have to vomit. And it's an incredible perception, you know, and a lot of people have known it one way or another, but no one ever did it as beautifully as he does it. In that book, when the poet gets his little bonus of £5, I think it was, and takes his friends out to dinner, and his girl, and just makes a mess of everything, and just starts ordering more and more stuff, and finally, I think, literally vomits it, as I remember, before the meal was over. And I never could get it out of my head. I mean, it was one of those perceptions I've just lived with for years, ever since I read that book, and I've applied it 1,000 times. I see it myself, I see it in others, and it's a book that, in a funny way, I think has had a salutary effect upon me. It's given me more charity and compassion than I might have had naturally by myself. Orwell's always good for that.
What is remarkable about him is his just his ability to cut through the ideological constraints and to say just what. You know, I think perhaps the best comment is the one that he himself made about Borkenau. But I think when he reviewed one of Borkenau's books, he commented that it was encouraging to hear a human voice when 50,000 gramophones are playing the same tune. And I think that applies very well to him. He just never was one of those gramophones. You know. He insisted on describing what was really happening, paying great attention to the ordinary, decent, common man who, as he continually says, never makes it beyond the sweatshops or the jails or the trenches, but of course is really creating history.
You know, there's an awful lot of discussion, always, and usually very boring, about the relation of the artist to society, where I think normally one has to make a distinction between one's responsibilities as a citizen and one's responsibilities as a writer, which are different. The perpetual social responsibility of a writer, because his medium is language, is to use, first of all, himself to use the language correctly, and secondly, to fight when it's corrupted, as it continuously is. And Orwell, in such an essay as Language and Politics, did one of the social jobs which it is the duty of a writer to do. And I constantly think of him now when I see the sort of euphemisms that he used by the missile people, for example. The capacity to blow things to bits is now called disassembly. Now Orwell will certainly pick that one up. The other thing is that if you are, as in the sense one would have to say Orwell was engagé, I mean he certainly had very definite political views, that there's always a danger, if one has that, of either not distorting but omitting facts that maybe are not very pleasant for your views. For that reason, I regard Homage to Catalonia as the most extraordinarily brave work, because, as you know, he was in Spain, and he found out that everything wasn't black and white, and wrote so. And I believe that the book was refused publication by 7 publishers, because people on the left didn't want to hear these things. And this, I thought, was an extraordinarily brave act, and again, an example of social responsibility.
I was speaking only the other day to a friend of mine who's the same age as I am and saying this present world is very difficult for us because it's changed so much that now I'm coming on for 60. It seems as though I really don't I have to hold on so hard to keep in touch with what's happening at all. And he said, and I think it has a certain truth, that probably most of us didn't think we should survive the war. We had a false cataclysmic idea of what would happen, that we would be blotted out. Perhaps it was easier, since we were trying to stop this war by one reason or another, just to think that would be the end of it. And I think Orwell was a very considerable artist who was imprisoned by this thing. He says himself that what he had to write became entirely political. He cared about words, but those words assumed a political form because life had to be political. And this was right. I would have written the same way if I had been writing at that time. I didn't come to write until after the war, until indeed 1950. And then one had to face the fact that it wasn't the end. It wasn't even, as he had said in 1984, it wasn't only that the war hadn't been the end, it wasn't going to lead up to this kind of terrible, horrible 1984 vision. It was just going on a kind of precipice edge, which is what her life has been since then, and yet living, we had to live, living with a certain amount of gaiety as one tried, and with prosperity on a knife edge. And for this kind of world, I don't think he really had anything to say, because he had given all his talent, all his love of words, which was his greatest thing, he had given this to trying to alter the unjust and precarious world in which he lived, and a world which I suspect he didn't really think would survive.
1984, I think, is great work. You know, if he hadn't written 1984, then he'd be respected, but he would not be taken seriously. I don't think there'd be a program about him today. 1984 it was the book of which he capped his career, and for 3/4 of it, for 4/5 of it, it's a mighty book, and again in a quiet, modest, unpretending fashion, which is also always what's marvelous about him. He's always better than he seems to be at any given moment, because there's just no, there's just no, he just never does any weightlifting as a writer. He's never straining, he's never, he make you feel all that rich Baroque power that some of us are guilty of making the reader feel. He's always just there quietly, and in boxing terms, when the fellow was knocked down by him, but no one ever quite saw the punch. It just seemed rather an economical punch, and then there's the guy on the floor. So, with all that, I say, Toying as a modest book, nonetheless, it gets into something that's absolutely incredible, which is it's the only political book that's been written, I think, since the Second World War that is prophetic and profoundly prophetic. At the time when it came out, it seemed a little far-fetched that Russia and China would be splitting off from one another, and each of them individually making alliances with America. Well, all right, we already can see the perfect possibility of America and Russia actually literally fighting a war together against China sometime in the future. We can see that possibility. It doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to imagine America and China teaming up against Russia if there was some change in the balance of forces. But the extraordinary perception that Orwell had in 1984 was that when these wars took place, they were not going to be totalistic wars, utterly annihilating wars. They were going to be dull, awful, obscene, miserable, picayune little wars that always be fought in unimportant places and involve great waste of materials that would use up the productive resources of the world, that would just pollute the world and proceed to deaden the world and kill the world slowly, but there would never be anything dramatic about these wars. And of course Vietnam is the most extraordinary and perfect example of that. And they'd always be meaningless wars. And of course he was absolutely prophetic in the way he would talk about in that notion of war as peace. I mean, every war that America's fought recently, of course, has always fought in order to ensure the peace. We don't even go to war, as he predicted. The prophetic aspects of 1984 are just breathtaking. I mean, when you really start to look at them, I mean, the man gets to be more and more of a prophet all the time.